The dust reached Lieutenant Hartmann before the sound did, a brown curtain rolling over the steppe, thick enough to taste chalk and diesel on his tongue. This is the story of how an entire German field army walked into a steel trap, convinced until the very end that rescue was just over the horizon. It's told from the perspective of the men who fought in the ruins, froze in the cellars, and learned too late that political trophies cost more than blood. They cost entire generations. In the summer of 1942, Case Blue unrolled across the southern Soviet steppes like a parade ground exercise. The Sixth Army, commanded by General Friedrich Paulus, spearheaded the drive toward the Volga as part of Hitler's grand pivot away from Moscow. The objective was economic as much as strategic: seize the oil fields of the Caucasus, sever Soviet supply lines along the river, and crush the city that bore Stalin's name. Paulus was a staff officer by temperament, meticulous, cautious, a man who triple-checked logistics columns and supply manifests. His soldiers joked that he could plan a war but not win one. They would later stop joking. By late August, advance elements of the Sixth Army reached the suburbs of Stalingrad. The city sprawled along the western bank of the Volga for nearly 40 kilometers, a twisted spine of factories, rail yards, workers' housing blocks, and administrative buildings. Smoke from the Barricadi artillery plant, the Red October steelworks, and the tractor factory, already converted to tank production, smudged the horizon even before the Luftwaffe arrived. The troops called it the Black City. Up close it smelled of coal dust, machine oil, and the sweet rot of the Volga's marshy banks. On the 23rd of August, Luftwaffe 4 launched one of the heaviest bombing raids of the Eastern Front. Over 600 sorties hammered Stalingrad in a single afternoon. Junkers 88s and Heinkel 111s dropped incendiaries and high explosive across residential districts, fuel depots, and the riverfront. Fires erupted in waves, first orange, then white-hot as timber and tar ignited. The smoke and dust clouds rose so high that visibility collapsed for both sides. German infantry approaching from the west found themselves stumbling through a twilight haze at 2 in the afternoon, the sun a dull red coin somewhere overhead. Ash settled on their helmets like grey snow. One Gefreiter later wrote home that the air tasted like burned hair and gunpowder, and that he couldn't stop coughing for 3 days. The bombing achieved immediate tactical chaos. Thousands of Soviet civilians died in the flames. Water mains burst. Streets buckled into craters. But it also created the very terrain that would later strangle the Wehrmacht, a lunar landscape of rubble, half-collapsed walls, and subterranean passageways perfect for ambush. The Germans had inadvertently forged their own labyrinth. Hitler's directive to Army Group South framed Stalingrad not as a logistical node, but as a political trophy, a city that must fall, regardless of cost. Orders from the Führer's headquarters repeated the phrase, "at all costs," with the insistence of a broken gramophone. The General Staff raised quiet objections. The Sixth Army's flanks were stretched thin, held by Romanian and Italian divisions with obsolete equipment and poor morale. Supply lines ran back hundreds of kilometers across steppe roads that turned to soup in the rain. But Hitler waved off caution. The city's name alone justified the expenditure. Paulus, ever the loyal staff officer, obeyed. By mid-September, German units were grinding into the city itself, block by block. Commanders quickly discovered that every tactical assumption that worked on the steppe dissolved in the ruins. Radio communication broke down in the maze of brick and rebar. Map coordinates became meaningless when entire streets ceased to exist. Artillery barrages flattened buildings but left cellars intact, turning basements into fortified bunkers connected by sewer tunnels and drainage pipes. Control, in the traditional sense, evaporated. One battalion commander reported to division headquarters that he no longer knew where his own companies were, only that they were somewhere in the rubble, fighting. The German soldiers coined a new term for this kind of warfare: Rattenkrieg, rat war. It was a fight where visibility dropped to 10 meters, where grenades echoed down stairwells you couldn't see the top of, where the enemy might be above you, below you, or inside the wall. Traditional doctrines, combined arms maneuver, Schwerpunkt breakthroughs, encirclement via mobile armor, meant nothing when a single sniper in a grain elevator could pin down a company for a day. The troops began to understand, in a creeping, unspoken way, that Stalingrad was not a battle. It was a meat grinder with a factory whistle. And yet, in those early weeks, confidence remained. The Sixth Army had crushed Soviet defences from the Don to the Volga in a matter of weeks. Surely the city would fall before winter. Surely the Ivans would break. Surely the Luftwaffe's bombs and the Panzer's guns would finish what the infantry started. They were wrong on all counts. Picture yourself in that haze, lungs full of dust, boots crunching over shattered glass, the Volga glinting somewhere to your left through the smoke, and ahead the low crump of mortar fire echoing off walls you can't see. If this story grips you, if you want to follow these men into the frozen hell that's coming, hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Your engagement keeps this channel alive. Ahead lay the Rat War, a place where entire companies would vanish into cellars, where Soviet defenders would hug so close you could hear them breathing through the wall, and where the Volgas, black waters, would become the only thing separating survival from annihilation. Obergefreiter Klaus Becker heard the breathing first, a wet, rasping sound coming from somewhere behind the wallpaper in the apartment stairwell, and realized with ice-cold certainty that the wall itself was alive. What happened in Stalingrad's ruins redefined infantry combat for a generation. The tactics forged in those cellars and stairwells would be studied in staff colleges for decades, not as victories, but as cautionary tales about what happens when doctrine meets chaos and loses. By mid-September 1942, German units were locked in close quarters, fighting that dissolved every assumption their officers had brought from France or Poland. The rubble didn't just slow the advance, it rewrote the rules. Visibility dropped to the length of a room. Firefights erupted at distances where you could see the fear in your enemy's eyes. And the Soviets, under General Vasily Chuikov, had devised a counter-tactic so simple and brutal it neutered Germany's two greatest advantages, air superiority and artillery. Chuikov called it hugging the enemy. His order was explicit. Soviet infantry would stay within 50 meters of German lines at all times, closer if possible, inside grenade range. So close that Luftwaffe pilots couldn't distinguish friend from foe through the smoke, and artillery-forward observers couldn't call in fire without killing their own men. The result was a grinding, intimate kind of violence where battles were decided by who had more grenades, steadier nerves, and better reflexes in the dark. German assault groups adapted, but slowly. Typical storm teams shrank to 6 or 8 men, a squad leader, a machine gunner with an MG-34 or 42, 2 riflemen with MP-40s, a man carrying a flamethrower or satchel charges, and a grenadier hauling a canvas bag of stick grenades. They moved in leapfrog bounds. The MG team would set up in a doorway or crater, lay suppressive fire down a corridor or across a courtyard, and the assault element would rush forward, 10 meters, maybe 15, then dig in while the MG displaced forward, room by room, floor by floor, building by building. The sound of it was relentless. The MG-42's high cyclic rate, 1,200 rounds per minute, earned it the nickname Hitler's buzzsaw among the Soviets, a ripping snarl that echoed off concrete and made your teeth ache. Return fire came in staccato bursts from PPS-41s, the Soviet submachine gun with its distinctive 71-round drum magazine. In stairwells, the concussion from grenades turned the air into a solid fist. Men learned to cup their ears and open their mouths before detonations to keep their eardrums from rupturing. Afterward, they tasted chalk and copper, plaster dust and blood aerosolized by the blast. Flamethrowers became prized weapons in the factory districts. The Barricadi, Red October and tractor plants were forests of steel, turbine halls, blast furnaces, conveyor, systems and catwalks that turned into 3-dimensional kill zones. A burst from a flamethrower into a machine shop or assembly floor would fill the space with superheated steam and smoke, forcing defenders out or cooking them where they stood. The smell, kerosene, singed hair, and something sweet and nauseating that no one wanted to name, clung to the operators' uniforms for days. Many refused to carry the tanks after watching a comrade take a rifle round through the fuel reservoir and turn into a human torch. Armour, the pride of the Wehrmacht, became a liability. Panzer IIIs and IVs that had raced across the steppe now crawled through rubble at walking pace, turrets traversing nervously, commanders exposed in the hatches scanning for threats at ranges under 100 meters. Soviet anti-tank rifles, the PTRD and PTRS, punched through side armor from basements and second-story windows. Molotov cocktails rained from rooftops. Mines, some improvised from artillery shells, waited under debris piles. Tanks couldn't elevate their main guns high enough to hit targets above the third floor, and they couldn't depress them low enough to engage cellars. Drivers went half-blind, navigating craters and fallen beams. More than one crew died when their vehicle bellied on rubble and became a stationary target for every Soviet gun in a 3-block radius. The panzers were relegated to fire support, mobile pillboxes that would park at intersections, blast a specific window or bunker, then reverse into cover before return fire arrived. Crews began to speak of their vehicles as Eisensarge, iron coffins. The intimate terror of tank warfare in Stalingrad was this: you were blind, nearly immobile, and everyone wanted you dead. One German officer, in a report that would later circulate among staff, wrote a phrase that captured the futility. Der Feind ist unsichtbar. The enemy is invisible. It was a complaint, but also a recognition. Soviet snipers, some of them women, which scandalized the Wehrmacht, would wait for hours in shattered apartments, taking single shots that dropped officers and radio operators. Sappers crawled through sewers and drainage pipes, emerging behind German lines to plant mines or slit sentries' throats. Entire squads would vanish into the warren of cellars and tunnels, only to reappear a block away, attacking from an unexpected angle. The city itself was the enemy's weapon. At night, the fighting took on a surreal quality. Flares arced over the Volga, green for the Soviets, red for the Germans, casting skeletal shadows across the ruins. The river's east bank remained in Soviet hands, and every night, ferries and barges made the crossing under artillery fire. German sentries on the cliffs could hear the diesel engines thumping across the water, could see the splashes of near misses and the white arcs of tracer fire, but could do little to stop it. The Volga was a lifeline the Soviets defended with fanatical determination, and the Germans never managed to sever it completely. In the wreckage of what had been an apartment block, now just a grid reference on a map, a young lieutenant crouched beside his radio man and tried to explain their position to battalion headquarters. He gave up after the third attempt and simply said, "We're in hell. Send ammunition." The Volga glittered in the distance, black and indifferent, and across its width came the low rumble of engines that promised the Soviets would fight tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. The horizon lit up orange at 4:30 in the morning on November 19th, and Hauptmann Ernst Weber, sheltering in a Romanian bunker 20 kilometers northwest of Stalingrad, felt the earth shudder through his boots like a drum roll played on his bones. This section marks the moment the hunters became the hunted. In 72 hours, the largest encirclement in military history would snap shut, trapping nearly 300,000 men in a pocket of frozen steppe. Most wouldn't realize they were doomed until the last escape route vanished behind them. Operation Uranus struck with the coordination of a guillotine blade. At 0500 hours on November 19th, Soviet artillery opened fire along a 100-kilometer front north and south of Stalingrad. The barrage hit the 3rd Romanian Army positions with a density not seen since Verdun. Thousands of guns, Katyusha rocket batteries screaming their freight train wail across the darkness, and mortars dropping rounds into trenches at rates that turned the frozen earth into a shaking, fragmenting nightmare. Romanian soldiers, poorly equipped, inadequately supplied, stretched thin to guard the 6th Army's northern flank, broke almost immediately. The Romanians had been given a job beyond their capacity. Their anti-tank guns were French 37s captured in 1940, barely adequate against light armour, and utterly useless against the new Soviet T-34s. Their winter clothing was thin, their rations were worse than the Germans, and they'd been told, repeatedly, that the front was quiet, that the Soviets were finished, that they were simply holding ground until spring. When the first waves of Soviet armour crested the ridgelines at dawn, dark silhouettes against a grey November sky, exhaust streaming, many Romanian units didn't fight. They ran. German liaison officers scrambled to restore the line. Panzer units were thrown into hasty counterattacks, but the numbers were overwhelming. The Soviets had massed forces in secrecy, the 5th Tank Army, the 21st Army, entire corps of infantry and cavalry that German intelligence had either missed or dismissed as incapable of offensive action. By midday on the 19th, Soviet tanks were 20 kilometers behind the Romanian front, rampaging through supply dumps and headquarters units that had believed themselves safely in the rear. To the south, the second jaw of the trap sprang shut on November 20th. The 4th Romanian Army, guarding the 6th Army's southern flank, collapsed under the weight of the Soviet 51st and 57th Armies. Again, the pattern repeated: artillery barrage, mass armour assault, defensive lines dissolving like wet paper. German reserves raced to plug gaps that widened faster than they could be filled. Radio traffic became a cacophony of contradictory orders, desperate pleas for reinforcements, and terse notifications that entire battalions were no longer in contact. Inside Stalingrad, Paulus and his staff received fragmentary reports that didn't yet cohere into the full picture of disaster. The flanks were under pressure, that much was clear, but the front was always under pressure. The Romanians were falling back, unfortunate but not catastrophic. Reserves were being committed. Counterattacks were being organised. It wasn't until the evening of November 21st that the scale of the crisis became undeniable. Soviet pincers were driving eastward and westward simultaneously, converging on the town of Kalach, a crossing point over the Don River 60 kilometers west of Stalingrad. At Kalach, a strange and almost farcical scene unfolded in the early morning darkness of November 23rd. A column of Soviet tanks approached the bridge from the west, headlights on, moving confidently. German sentries, exhausted and confused by days of chaotic combat, assumed they were German armour withdrawn from the front. By the time someone realised the silhouettes were wrong, too rounded, turrets too squat, the Soviets were already across. A brief firefight erupted. The bridge was captured intact, and with that, the encirclement snapped shut. In 6th Army headquarters, staff officers stared at situation maps that now showed a closed ring around their positions. Someone, accounts differ on who, muttered the word that would define the next 10 weeks. Kessel, cauldron, a pocket, a trap. Radio operators began using the term in traffic, and within hours it had spread through the army like a contagion. They were in the Kessel, cut off, surrounded. Nearly 20 German divisions, elements of 2 Romanian divisions, supporting units, logistics personnel, headquarters staff, roughly 290,000 men, now isolated on the steppe with winter closing in. Paulus requested permission to break out. It was the only rational move: consolidate forces, abandon heavy equipment if necessary, and fight westward while the Soviet ring was still thin and disorganized. His corps commanders agreed. Even some of the more fanatical National Socialist leadership officers, normally parrots for Berlin's propaganda, quietly admitted that staying meant annihilation. On November 24th, the answer came back from the Führer's headquarters. Negative. The 6th Army would hold its positions. No retreat, no breakout. Hitler's logic, if it could be called logic, was twofold. First, abandoning Stalingrad would be a political disaster, a propaganda gift to Stalin that Berlin couldn't afford. Second, and more catastrophically, Hermann Göring had promised that the Luftwaffe could supply the encircled army by air. The promise was ludicrous on its face. 6th Army required between 300 and 700 tons of supplies per day, the lower figure representing emergency starvation rations, the higher representing something approaching sustainability. Göring, eager to restore his tarnished prestige after years of Luftwaffe failures, assured Hitler that his transport fleet could deliver 500 tons daily. Luftwaffe logistics officers, who actually understood tonnage and aircraft capacity and weather and distances, blanched. They knew it was impossible. They said so quietly, in reports that were ignored. Paulus, the staff officer who always obeyed, accepted the order. He began organising the Kessel's defence, distributing units along a perimeter that stretched roughly 50 kilometres east to west and 40 north to south. Meanwhile, a new command structure was being assembled to the southwest. Army Group Don, under Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, tasked with punching through the Soviet ring and relieving the 6th Army. Manstein was arguably the Wehrmacht's finest operational commander, a man who understood maneuver warfare and had pulled off miracles before. If anyone could break the Kessel open, it would be him. But Manstein would need time to assemble forces, time to plan, time to position his panzers for the thrust. And time was the one thing the men inside the Kessel didn't have. Stand at that bridge at Kallach in the frozen pre-dawn of November 23rd, watching the last gap close. Behind you, 290,000 men who don't yet know they're already ghosts. Ahead lay the airlift, a promise scrawled in ice and exhaust, where Juncker's transports would race against arithmetic and winter and lose. Lieutenant Dieter Schultz watched frost crystals form on the Junkers 52's windscreen faster than he could scrape them clear, and knew with sick certainty that this flight would kill someone, pilot, crew, or the starving men waiting below. The Stalingrad airlift was a mathematical death sentence dressed up as a lifeline. The numbers were simple, brutal, and understood by everyone except the man who ordered it. This is the story of how arithmetic became murder, and how hundreds of aircraft vanished into the winter sky carrying hope they could never deliver. The Luftwaffe needed to deliver between 300 and 700 tons of supplies per day to keep the 6th Army operational, the lower figure representing bare survival rations, minimal ammunition, and emergency medical supplies, the higher figure allowing something approaching combat effectiveness. Göring had promised 500. What the transport fleet actually managed, averaged across the 10 weeks of the airlift, was 115 tons per day. 115 tons. Not even enough to prevent slow starvation, let alone sustain an army. The shortfall wasn't from lack of effort. Luftwaffe transport crews flew into conditions that bordered on suicide. The main supply base was Tatsinskaya airfield, roughly 200 kilometers west of the Kessel, far enough to require long flight times in lumbering, unheated aircraft, close enough that Soviet bombers could reach it. Pilots lifted off in near-zero visibility, navigating by compass and instinct through clouds that iced their wings and turned propeller blades into unbalanced clubs that shook the airframe. Anti-aircraft fire from Soviet positions around the Kessel turned the approach corridors into flak alleys where shells burst in black flowers against the grey sky. The aircraft themselves were never meant for this. The Junkers 52, the Luftwaffe's workhorse transport, nicknamed Tante Ju, or Auntie Junkers, was a corrugated metal trimator designed for cargo and paratroop drops, not flying into contested airspace in blizzard conditions. It was slow, unarmoured, and carried at most 2.5 tons of cargo. Simple arithmetic. To deliver 300 tons per day required 120 sorties, every single day, in winter, under fire. They tried. God, they tried. Crews flew double and triple missions, landing at improvised strips inside the Kessel just long enough to kick supply crates out the door before taking off again. Ground crews at Tatsinskaya worked through the night in temperatures that froze engine oil solid and turned metal tools into skin-ripping hazards. They preheated engines with blowtorches, packed supply crates by hand, and loaded aircraft in darkness lit only by shielded lanterns because Soviet night bombers prowled overhead. The peak effort came between December 19th and 21st, 3 days when every available aircraft was thrown into the shuttle. Across those 72 hours, the Luftwaffe managed to deliver approximately 700 tons total. It felt like a victory until someone did the math. 700 tons over 3 days averaged to 233 tons per day, still well below minimum requirements and utterly unsustainable. Crews were collapsing from exhaustion. Aircraft were breaking down faster than they could be repaired, and the weather was getting worse. Then the Soviets moved. On December 24th, Christmas Eve, Soviet armour overran Tatsinskaya airfield. Transports still on the ground scrambled into the air in a chaotic evacuation, engines barely warm, crews throwing themselves aboard moving aircraft. Some made it out, others were strafed on the runway or captured intact. The few that escaped flew to Salsk and Novocherkassk, airfields even farther from the Kessel. Flight times increased, fuel consumption increased, tonnage delivered per sortie decreased. By late January, the airlift had withered to 60 to 80 tons per day, barely enough to feed a division, let alone an army. Inside the Kessel, the arithmetic expressed itself in flesh. Rations shrank week by week, first to 400 grams of bread per day, then 300, then 200. Eventually, many units were receiving less than that, a fist-sized chunk of bread so frozen it had to be thawed against body heat before you could bite it. Soldiers coined a new term, Eisbrot, ice bread. It tasted like sawdust and left your stomach cramping for anything with calories. Horse meat became a staple. The Sixth Army had entered the Kessel with tens of thousands of horses, draft animals for artillery, supply wagons and cavalry units. They were slaughtered systematically, butchered in open fields, with the wind carrying the smell of blood and offal across the snow. The meat was boiled into thin stews that were more water than protein, or hacked into strips and gnawed half-frozen. When the horses ran out, men boiled leather, belts, harnesses, boot liners. The results were inedible in any real sense, but they gave your jaw something to work on and your stomach the illusion of being filled. Mess tins became precious. A hot meal, even a watery broth with flecks of meat you didn't examine too closely, was the highlight of the day. Men cupped the tins against their chests to absorb the warmth before eating, letting the steam rise into their faces. The smell varied by unit and supply, sometimes kerosene from field stoves, sometimes the metallic tang of canned rations months past their date, sometimes just the yeasty reek of ersatz bread and boiled roots scavenged from civilian gardens. Hunger hollowed men from the inside. Faces thinned, eyes sank into sockets. Cheekbones emerged sharp beneath greyish skin. Men moved slower, spoke less, conserved energy for the essential tasks, standing guard, clearing jammed weapons, shuffling through supply lines for the daily ration draw. Thoughts turned repetitive, circling back endlessly to food, memories of meals eaten years ago, fantasies of what they'd eat when they got home, negotiations over who had the larger half of a shared piece of bread. In early January 1943, Soviet emissaries approached German lines under a white flag. Their message was straightforward. Surrender now, and the Red Army would provide normal rations, medical care, and repatriation after the war. Captured German soldiers would be treated according to international conventions. The offer was radioed to Berlin for instructions. The response came back terse and final. Capitulation out of the question. Paulus read the order to his staff without comment. Some of the officers stared at the message as if the words might rearrange themselves into something sane. Others simply nodded. Orders were orders. The Sixth Army would fight until relieved or destroyed. The men in the line, the Lancers shivering in dugouts and basements, chewing ice bread and waiting for the planes that never brought enough, weren't consulted. They learned about the refused surrender offer through whispers and rumours that spread through the Kessel like frost. Outside the pocket, far to the southwest, Manstein's relief force was forming up. Panzer divisions, artillery, supplies, everything needed for one last thrust to break the ring and pull the Sixth Army out of the trap. Picture that airfield on Christmas Eve. Transports clawing into the air while tank shells burst among the parked aircraft, crews leaving everything behind except the hope they could outrun the flames. Ahead lay winter storm, a spearhead driving through snow and blood, close enough that trapped men could hear the guns, but never close enough to matter. Dying, Gefreiter. Hans Keller pressed his ear against the frozen earth on the western edge of the Kessel and swore he could hear thunder rolling across the steppe. Except it was December 12th, and thunder didn't come in rhythmic salvos that made the ground tremble every 30 seconds. This is the moment when hope becomes cruelty. When men trapped in a shrinking pocket can hear salvation approaching, can count the kilometres by the volume of distant guns, and then watch that sound fade back into silence. The relief of Stalingrad failed not from lack of courage, but from mathematics written in frozen mud and burning tanks. Operation Winter Storm, Unternehmen Wintergewitter, launched on December 12, 1942, from Kotelnikovo, a rail junction south of the Kessel. Manstein had assembled the 57th Panzer Corps. 3 armoured divisions, supporting infantry and artillery, spearheaded by the 6th Panzer Division under General Erhard Rauss. The plan was brutal in its simplicity. Drive northeast through Soviet lines, punch a corridor to the Kessel's southern perimeter, and either extract the Sixth Army or resupply them long enough to organize a fighting breakout. The first days went well, suspiciously well. German armour covered 60 kilometres in 48 hours. smashing through scattered Soviet resistance, overrunning supply depots, scattering rifle divisions that weren't prepared for a winter offensive. Tank commanders stood in open hatches watching the steppe roll past under their tracks, white and featureless, punctuated by burning villages and columns of smoke from knocked-out Soviet positions. The weather was cold but clear. Visibility extended for kilometers. It felt briefly like the summer campaigns, like the war they knew how to win. By December 19th, the relief force had reached the Mishkova River, a frozen stream barely 10 meters wide that marked the last significant terrain barrier between Manstein's panzers and the Kessel. The distance to the pocket's southern edge, somewhere between 35 and 48 kilometers, depending on which staff officer you asked and which map they were reading. Close enough that forward observers in the relief column could see flares rising from the Kessel at night, green and red stars arcing against the black sky, signals from an army that knew help was near, and close enough that men inside the Kessel could hear the relief force. Not just imagine it, not just hope for it, but hear it. The distant crump of artillery duels, the low rumble of tank guns, sounds carried across the frozen steppe on air so cold it transmitted vibrations like a drum skin. Soldiers in forward positions crawled out of bunkers and trenches, stood in the open despite sniper fire, and listened. Some wept, others laughed. A few started packing their gear, certain they'd be marching out within days. In desperation and defiance, some units laid out signal. Panels in the snow, white cloth strips arranged to spell, "Kommt, come." The panels were visible from the air, but whether they were seen by the relief force or only by Soviet reconnaissance aircraft remains debated by historians. What's certain is that the message was never answered, because on the Mishkova, winter storm died. The Soviet Second Guards Army, fresh units rushed from the strategic reserve, hit the German spearhead with everything they had. T-34s in dug-in positions, anti-tank guns zeroed on the river crossings, infantry in white winter camouflage emerging from snow trenches like ghosts. The 6th Panzer Division battered itself against the Soviet line for 3 days, losing tanks faster than they could be replaced, burning through ammunition and fuel at rates that couldn't be sustained. Manstein faced an impossible choice. To push farther required committing his last reserves. Units needed to hold open the corridor even if they reached the Kessel, and reaching the Kessel was no longer certain. Soviet reinforcements were arriving faster than German intelligence had predicted. The weather was turning. Snow squalls reduced visibility to meters. Temperatures dropped further. Frostbite cases soared. Worst of all, fuel stocks were critically low. Tanks that ran dry on the steppe became steel statues, useless, immobile, waiting for recovery vehicles that were themselves running out of diesel. And Paulus, inside the Kessel, refused to move. Manstein sent message after message, urging the 6th Army to break out toward the relief force. Even a fighting withdrawal, even abandoning heavy equipment, would halve the distance and make link-up possible. But Paulus held to Hitler's orders. No retreat from Stalingrad. The army would hold its positions and wait for relief to reach them. The perverse result was that the two forces, relief and trapped, sat 40 kilometers apart, both bleeding, neither willing or able to close the gap. By December 23rd, it was over. Soviet pressure forced Manstein to pull back from the Mishkova or risk encirclement of his own relief force. The panzers withdrew, fighting rearguard actions, leaving wrecked tanks and frozen corpses along the snow-covered steppe. Inside the Kessel, men who had stood listening to the sound of salvation heard it fade, kilometre by kilometre, day by day, back into silence. Daily life in the Kessel during December had developed its own grim rhythms. Frost-whitened greatcoats until men looked like moving snowdrifts. Felt boots, filzstiefel, the prized winter gear that some units had and most didn't, froze stiff overnight and had to be thawed near stoves before you could put them on. Sentries on watch slapped their arms against their sides to keep blood moving, a motion so constant it became unconscious. The cold wasn't dramatic. It was patient, persistent, working its way through layers of wool and cotton to find skin. Lice thrived in the layered uniforms, breeding. In seams and folds where body heat collected, men scratched until they bled, fingernails tearing through wool to reach skin that was already raw. Disinfectant was scarce, supply flights prioritized ammunition and food over hygiene, and delousing became a black joke. You could burn lice out with a candle flame run along the seams, but that risked setting your only coat on fire. Better to scratch and endure. Medical care collapsed by degrees. Dressing stations ran out of ether and morphine first, then bandages, then basic sutures. Surgeries were performed with whatever anesthesia remained, often nothing more than a leather strap to bite and a shot of schnapps if you were lucky. Wounds that would have been survivable with proper treatment became death sentences. Frostbite cases overwhelmed the aid stations, blackened fingers and toes that cracked like charcoal when touched, requiring amputation with hacksaws sterilized over field stoves. Snow was packed into wounds as a temporary measure when bandages ran out, a technique that reduced bleeding but introduced infections that would kill days later. Field stoves burned whatever could be found, furniture smashed from ruined buildings, wooden doors, ammunition crates, even frozen corpse wood when nothing else remained. The smoke inside bunkers and cellars mixed with the acrid bite of cordite from stored ammunition and the sweet-sour smell of rotting horseflesh, horses butchered weeks ago, frozen solid, thawing slowly in corners no one wanted to investigate too closely. Mail from home dried up after late November. The letters that did arrive, carried on the supply flights when there was space, were dated September, October, written by families who still believed the newsreels, who thought their sons and husbands were winning. Men reread those letters until the paper went soft from handling, words smudged by dirty fingers and sweat. Some carried photographs, wives, children, parents standing in summer gardens that now seemed like hallucinations from another life, and the rumors circulated endlessly. Relief was coming by Christmas. Relief was coming in January. The Führer had a secret plan. Goering had promised 1,000 planes. Manstein was regrouping for another thrust. Men repeated the rumors because hope was the only ration that didn't require airlift. Imagine standing on that western perimeter in late December, hearing the guns fade day by day, and realizing with each passing hour that no one is coming, that the thunder you heard was hope itself dying in the snow. Ahead lay January, the final collapse, where soldiers would learn that cold and hunger were not the worst things waiting for them, and that surrender was just the beginning of another hell. Unteroffizier Werner Schmidt discovered he could no longer remember warmth, not as a sensation but as a concept, the way a man born blind cannot imagine colour. January 1943 was not a battle. It was an execution carried out in slow motion, where the executioners were cold, hunger and mathematics, and the condemned had nowhere to run. This is the final descent, the weeks when an army ceased to exist as a fighting force and became a population of starving men waiting for the inevitable. Temperatures in late December and January routinely fell well below -20 degrees Celsius. Exact measurements varied by location. Weather stations recorded different extremes, but the lived experience was universal. Exposed skin froze in minutes, breath crystallized into ice on scarves and collars. Metal touched barehanded would strip away flesh. Frostbite cases surged beyond the capacity of medical units to treat. Fingers and toes went black and numb, then turned to something resembling freezer-burned meat. Men woke to find their feet had frozen solid inside their boots overnight. Amputations were performed in unheated cellars with whatever cutting tools remained sharp. Fuel stocks for vehicles and stoves dwindled to nothing. Foxholes iced over from the inside, breath condensing and freezing on earthen walls until soldiers were entombed in frost-lined graves. Some simply stopped moving in the night, bodies found in the morning curled into fetal positions, rifles clutched against chests, expressions suggesting they'd fallen asleep rather than died. Perhaps they had. Hypothermia's final stage brings warmth, a hallucinatory comfort that makes men strip off their clothes and lie down in the snow, convinced they're overheating. Ammunition rationing reached absurd levels. Riflemen received a handful of cartridges per day, 5, maybe 10 rounds, expected to last 24 hours. Machine gun crews hoarded their belts like misers counting gold, rationing bursts to single boxes per position per night. Artillery batteries counted shells individually. Mortars went silent for lack of rounds. The result was a peculiar quiet that settled over the Kessel, punctuated by sporadic rifle cracks and grenade detonations, but lacking the sustained roar that had defined the autumn fighting. German soldiers began adopting captured Soviet weapons, particularly the PPSH-41 submachine gun. The PPSH, nicknamed the burp gun for its distinctive sound, had advantages that outweighed national pride. Its 71-round drum magazine meant you could fight longer without reloading, critical in stairwell and basement combat where seconds mattered. Its simple blowback mechanism was nearly foolproof, functioning even when caked with ice and mud. And most importantly, ammunition was available, stripped from Soviet dead, scavenged from captured supply dumps, traded between units like currency. The sight became common. German. Soldiers in tattered field-grey greatcoats, Hungarian or Romanian caps scavenged from allies, armed with Russian submachine guns and carrying Mosin-Nagant rifles as backups. National identity dissolved under necessity. What mattered was whether the weapon fired and whether you had rounds to feed it. The factories, barricadi, Red October, tractor works, remained contested ground through January. These massive industrial complexes had been reduced to skeletal ruins, but their steel frames and concrete foundations created three-dimensional fortresses. Soviet defenders occupied machine shops and assembly halls. German assault pioneers attacked with flamethrowers and hollow-charge grenades. Flames roared through turbine halls, superheating the air until it scorched lungs and ignited anything flammable. Smoke, black from burning oil, white from steam, grey from explosives, filled the spaces until visibility dropped to arm's length. The sounds layered into a hellish symphony, flamethrowers whooshing like dragons breathing, hollow charges detonating with flat concussive bangs, steel beams groaning as heat stress made them twist, and underneath it all the screams, German and Russian, indistinguishable in pitch and terror. Night remained the most active time. The sky flickered with signal flares, green for Soviet positions, red for German, casting shadows that jumped and twisted across the ruins. German outposts along the Volga cliffs timed Soviet barge crossings by sound. The rhythmic thump of diesel engines carrying across water and ice, the splash of near-miss artillery rounds, the grinding of steel hulls against ice pans. The Soviets kept ferrying supplies and reinforcements despite German fire, accepting losses to maintain the pressure. On January 10th, the Red Army launched its final offensive to liquidate the Kessel. Operation Ring, another grimly appropriate Soviet codename, opened with a massive artillery barrage that made the November attacks look restrained. The perimeter, already contracting, began to collapse in sections. German units fought delaying actions from one block to the next, one bunker to the next, buying hours rather than days. There was nowhere to retreat to except smaller pockets of rubble, and eventually no pockets left. By January 25th, the last serviceable airstrip inside the Kessel fell to Soviet infantry. The Potomnik airfield, the main evacuation point for wounded, was overrun in a final chaotic scramble, where transport planes took off under direct fire, some making it airborne, others exploding on the runway or crashing in flames beyond the perimeter. Approximately 18,000 wounded men remained trapped inside the pocket with no hope of evacuation. Field hospitals became warehouses for the dying. The pocket split on January 28th. Soviet forces drove a wedge through the centre, severing the Kessel into two isolated groups, a southern pocket around the city centre under Paulus's direct command, and a northern pocket in the factory district under General Karl Strecker. Communication between them became sporadic, then ceased entirely. Each fragment fought alone. On January 30th, the 10th anniversary of Hitler's rise to power, a date chosen deliberately for propaganda, Paulus received a radio message from Berlin. He was promoted to Field Marshal. The promotion was not an honour, it was a directive. No German Field Marshal had ever been captured alive. The implication was explicit. Paulus was expected to die at his post, preferably by his own hand, preserving the myth that German officers chose death over dishonour. Paulus, a lifelong Catholic who took moral prohibitions against suicide seriously, declined. Accounts vary. Some reported second-hand, others from post-war interviews. But the most quoted version has him remarking that he would not shoot himself for this bohemian corporal. The comment, if accurate, was perhaps his only recorded act of defiance against the regime he'd served faithfully for 12 years. On January 31st, Soviet infantry stormed the basement headquarters in the ruins of the Univermag department store, where Paulus had established his command post. He surrendered without resistance. 22 generals capitulated with him, one of the largest mass surrenders of senior officers in German military history. Paulus became the first German field marshal ever taken prisoner. The northern pocket under Strecker held out 2 more days. Ammunition exhausted, food gone, positions overrun, he radioed a final message to Berlin on February 2nd. The signal broke with military convention. Instead of the customary closing Heil Hitler, Strecker and his chief of staff, Helmuth Grosskirth, ended with Es lebe Deutschland, long live Germany. It was a small act of rebellion, a gesture towards something larger than the regime, a recognition that the nation might survive what the government had done to it. Then the radios went silent. Across the frozen ruins, grey-coated figures emerged from cellars and bunkers, hands raised, rifles discarded, shuffling towards Soviet assembly points through snow stained with oil and blood. Many could barely walk. Some crawled. Others simply sat down and waited to be collected or die, too exhausted to care which came first. Stand in that department store basement on January 31st, watching a field marshal stub out his cigarette and prepare to meet his captors, knowing that promotion and surrender came within 24 hours, a final absurdity in a campaign built on them. Ahead lay captivity, a march east through snow and typhus, where most of the survivors would learn that surrender was not the end of their suffering, only a transition to a different kind of hell. Obergefreiter. Paul Richter watched a man who'd survived 5 months of Stalingrad die on the 3rd day of captivity, collapsing face first into snow that had turned brown from the column of prisoners shuffling ahead. Surrender was not salvation. For the 91,000 Axis soldiers who entered Soviet captivity between late January and early February 1943, the war simply transformed into a different kind of dying, slower, colder, and measured in kilometers marched rather than meters defended. The columns formed in the ruins under Soviet guard. Grey-coated figures, Germans, Romanians, Italians, Hungarians, a multinational wreckage of Hitler's eastern ambitions, were assembled in groups of hundreds, then thousands, and marched eastward toward collection points and railheads deeper in Soviet territory. Many could barely stand. Months of starvation had reduced them to skeletal approximations of soldiers, hollow-cheeked, sunken-eyed, uniforms hanging loose on frames that had lost 20 or 30 kilograms. Some still carried personal items, photographs, letters, prayer books tucked into paybooks, small anchors to the lives they'd had before Stalingrad. Soviet soldiers photographed the surrendering columns, images that would later circulate as propaganda victories. In those photographs, details tell their own stories. Belt buckles still bearing the inscription, Gott mit uns, God with us. A bitter irony not lost on the men wearing them. Faces stared at the camera with expressions beyond exhaustion, beyond fear, settled into a numb acceptance that this was simply what happened next. A few still wore their decorations, iron crosses, wound badges, talismans that meant nothing now except as markers of how far they'd fallen. The march east became a death sentence delivered in installments. Men died from exhaustion, simply lying down in the snow and not rising. They died from wounds that had been suppressed by adrenaline and necessity during the fighting, infections blooming once the body stopped moving. They died from dysentery that turned their guts to water, too weak to keep walking, falling behind the column to squat beside the road and never standing again. And they died from typhus, the louse-borne disease that had incubated in the filthy conditions of the Kessel and now exploded through the packed prisoner columns like wildfire through dry timber. Typhus announced itself with fever and headache, then progressed to delirium and a distinctive rash. In the overcrowded conditions of the march and temporary camps, lice spread from man to man, carrying the bacteria in their guts. Within weeks, thousands were infected. Those who showed symptoms were often left behind, isolated in field hospitals that were really just barns or warehouses where the dying were gathered to keep them from infecting others. Medical care was minimal. Most never left those isolation wards alive. survivors later described. Hallucinations brought on by hunger and typhus, visions of meals that dissolved when you reached for them, conversations with dead comrades who walked beside you offering cigarettes, landscapes that twisted and melted like wax, the metallic stench of blood, from nosebleeds, from coughing, from wounds that wouldn't close, mixed with the smell of unwashed bodies, excrement, and the sweet, sour reek of gangrene. Some men stopped recognizing their own names. Soviet guards varied in their treatment of prisoners. Some showed rough compassion, sharing bread, allowing rest stops, burying the dead with minimal ceremony. Others were vindictive, remembering what German forces had done during the invasion, how Wehrmacht and SS units had burned villages and shot civilians and left a trail of atrocities across the Western Soviet Union. Those guards drove the columns hard, beat stragglers, and watched with satisfaction as Germans died in the snow. Both reactions were understandable. The Eastern Front had been a war of annihilation from the beginning, and mercy was a commodity neither side had stockpiled. Of the 91,000 men who surrendered, only about 5,000 to 6,000 would see Germany again. Most not until the mid-1950s, a full decade after the war ended. The rest died in captivity, in the first weeks from typhus and exhaustion, in the first year from malnutrition and disease in permanent camps, across the subsequent years from overwork in labor battalions, mines, and construction projects scattered across the Soviet interior. Some graves were marked, most weren't. 22 generals were among the captured, one of the largest mass surrenders of senior officers in German military history. Their treatment was better than the common soldiers. Better quarters, adequate food, interrogations conducted with a degree of professional courtesy between officers. Some, including Paulus, would eventually cooperate with Soviet intelligence, making statements condemning the Nazi regime or participating in propaganda efforts aimed at convincing other German units to surrender. Others refused and died in captivity, stubbornly loyal to a government that had abandoned them. The wider Stalingrad campaign, from the summer offensive through the final capitulation, cost Germany and its allies approximately 500,000 casualties, killed, wounded, missing, and captured, an entire field army erased, dozens of divisions destroyed or rendered combat ineffective, and the material losses were staggering. Tanks, artillery vehicles, aircraft, equipment that couldn't be easily replaced as Germany's industrial capacity strained under Allied bombing and resource shortages. The Luftwaffe's airlift effort, the promise that had justified holding the Kessel, delivered approximately 8,250 tons total across 10 weeks, an average of 115 tons per day, against a minimum need of 300 to 700. Nearly 500 aircraft were written off, 266 Junkers 52s alone, plus Heinkel 111s, Focke-Wulf Condors, and other transports shot down, destroyed on the ground, or rendered unflyable by battle damage and mechanical failures. The transport fleet, already inadequate for Germany's logistics needs, was crippled. Experienced crews, pilots, navigators, radio operators, died in crashes or were captured when emergency landings went wrong. The loss rippled forward, affecting supply operations on other fronts for the remainder of the war. German tactical after-action reports compiled by surviving staff officers and later analysed in military colleges noted hard lessons. Armour must be integrated with infantry, engineers and artillery support in urban combat. Unsupported tanks in cities become iron coffins at ranges under 50 metres, vulnerable to grenades, Molotov cocktails and short-range anti-tank weapons. Strategic studies emphasise that logistics and weather outrank tactical brilliance. Without secure flanks, adequate supply, and consideration of environmental conditions, even battlefield victories can become operational disasters. But the most important lesson was simpler and more bitter. Orders to hold untenable positions, justified by political considerations rather than military reality, transform armies into graveyards. Stalingrad became shorthand in Wehrmacht diaries and staff discussions for doomed persistence, invoked whenever units were encircled or ordered to hold against overwhelming odds. Officers would mutter, "They want to make another Stalingrad," and the phrase carried all the accumulated horror of what that meant. In post-war recollections and interviews, some conducted immediately after liberation, others decades later, German veterans emphasized a sense of betrayal. not by their comrades who'd fought and died beside them, but by the promises, the airlift that couldn't deliver, the relief force that came close enough to hear but never arrived, the orders to hold that prioritized propaganda over survival. Many also admitted, with varying degrees of honesty, their own roles in atrocities during the earlier phases of Operation Barbarossa, the casual brutality that had characterized the invasion, the participation in or complicity with war crimes that had poisoned the entire campaign from the start. The psychological scar remained. Veterans carried Stalingrad with them, in nightmares that returned for decades, in silences that descended when the subject arose, in the knowledge that they'd survived where most hadn't, and that survival was as much accident as anything else. Some refused to discuss it entirely. Others talked compulsively, returning again and again to the details as if repetition might make sense of what had happened. The human cost calculated simply, of 91,000 captured, fewer than 6,000 returned. The math was brutal and final. Picture that column shuffling east through February snow. Thousands of men who'd fought through autumn and winter, now beginning a different kind of endurance test, where the enemy was distance, disease, and time. Ahead lay the final accounting, the strategic shift, the myth shattered, and the question of what Stalingrad meant beyond the immediate corpse count, how a single city became the turning point where invincibility died and the slow collapse began. In Berlin on February 3rd, 1943, the morning newspapers arrived with a black-bordered announcement, and across the Reich, millions of Germans learned that the Sixth Army had fallen, though most had never been told it was encircled in the first place. Stalingrad destroyed more than an army. It shattered the myth of German invincibility, shifted strategic initiative permanently to the Soviet Union, and marked the moment when the war's outcome became not a question of victory, but of how long defeat could be delayed. The macro outcome was stark. Germany lost an entire field army, 22 divisions annihilated, supporting units shredded, approximately 500,000 casualties across the wider campaign, when you counted the failed relief attempts and the flank collapses. The Eastern Front, which had been a series of German offensives punctuated by tactical withdrawals, became a grinding Soviet advance westward that would not stop until Berlin fell. After February 1943, Germany never regained strategic initiative in the East. Every subsequent operation, Kursk, the Dnieper battles, the retreat through Ukraine and Poland, was reactive, defensive, a long fighting withdrawal toward the inevitable. The Soviet victory at Stalingrad was not just military, it was psychological, propaganda, proof that the Wehrmacht could be beaten, encircled, destroyed. Stalin promoted it relentlessly. Newsreels showed German prisoners marching east, captured equipment displayed in Moscow, generals paraded before cameras. The message to the Soviet population, who'd endured 2 years of brutal occupation and retreat, was clear. The tide had turned. The message to the Western Allies was equally important. The Red Army could win this war, and any negotiated peace that left the Nazis in power was unthinkable. German home front reaction mixed shock and enforced silence. The regime had controlled information carefully through the autumn and winter. Newspapers and radio broadcasts trumpeted victories, downplayed setbacks, and simply omitted mention of the encirclement for weeks. Families with sons or husbands in the Sixth Army received no official word. Mail from the front had stopped in November, but that could be explained by winter disruptions, by heavy fighting, by temporary communication breakdowns. The February announcement was carefully worded. The Sixth Army had fought heroically. They had held against overwhelming odds. Their sacrifice had allowed other German forces to regroup and establish new defensive lines. Every soldier had done his duty to the last. The language was grandiose, mythologizing, designed to transform disaster into propaganda victory. A Thermopylae narrative where noble defeat proved German courage even in failure. But propaganda couldn't fill the silences at dinner tables. Families began receiving official notices months later, not killed in action, but missing. A bureaucratic hedge that avoided finalizing death, but prevented wives from remarrying or accessing survivor benefits. Some families would wait years for confirmation, holding on to hope that their men might be in Soviet camps, might return someday. Most never got bodies to bury, never got closure, only the gradually hardening certainty that missing meant dead. Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister, pivoted quickly. The disaster became a rallying cry: total war, total mobilization, total commitment to victory or annihilation. In a famous speech at the Berlin Sportpalast 2 weeks after Stalingrad's fall, he asked the audience if they wanted total war, and the crowd roared approval, a response choreographed and amplified, but reflecting genuine shock that the invincible Wehrmacht could lose an entire army. Within the military, Stalingrad became a reference point, a cautionary tale whispered in staff meetings and field headquarters. Whenever Hitler ordered units to hold encircled positions, whenever tactical withdrawals were forbidden for political reasons, officers and soldiers muttered about another Stalingrad. The phrase carried accumulated meaning: betrayal by high command, promises of relief that never arrived, airlift fantasies that couldn't overcome arithmetic, political considerations prioritized over soldiers' lives. The Eastern Front changed character after Stalingrad. German forces, already stretched thin, now faced an enemy emboldened by victory and reinforced by war industries relocated beyond the Urals. Soviet tactics improved, lessons learned from 2 years of defeat applied systematically. The Red Army that counterattacked at Stalingrad was not the same force that had collapsed in 1941. It had competent commanders who'd survived Stalin's purges, T-34 production in quantities that dwarfed German output, artillery in concentrations that made German barrages look modest, and an ideological commitment fueled by rage at what the invasion had cost. Germany's allies began reconsidering their commitments. Romania, Hungary, Italy, all had lost divisions at Stalingrad or in the follow-on Soviet offensives. The scales were tipping. Some began quiet diplomatic feelers toward the Western allies, exploring options for separate peace or switching sides. Trust within the Axis eroded. German forces increasingly took over positions previously held by allies, stretching Wehrmacht manpower even thinner. The final sensory details from Stalingrad, recorded in letters, diaries, and post-war interviews, coalesced into a particular atmosphere that survivors struggled to articulate. The last days sounded, they said, like cloth tearing, the distinctive rip of artillery airbursts in air so cold that sound behaved differently, sharper and flatter. The smell was coal smoke from dying stoves, cold iron where metal froze and gave off a particular metallic scent, and hunger, not the smell of starvation itself, but the absence of smell, the way everything became muted when your body shut down non-essential senses to conserve energy. Veterans described how cold and hunger rewired perception. Colors faded to grayscale. Time became elastic. Hours passed in minutes, or minutes stretched into hours. Memories fragmented. Vivid recall of specific moments, a comrade's face, the pattern of frost on a wall, the taste of melted snow, interspersed with blank gaps where entire days vanished. The mind, starved of calories and warmth, prioritized survival over continuity. Many could never fully explain Stalingrad to people who hadn't been there. How do you describe existing at the edge of death for months? How do you convey that after a certain point, fear becomes irrelevant because you're too exhausted to sustain it? How do you make someone understand that surrender, walking into Soviet captivity with no guarantee of survival, felt like relief simply because it meant the fighting was over? The German medics who worked through the Kessel's final weeks developed improvisations born of desperation. Splints fashioned from bed slats, screws removed from furniture to use in bone repairs, leather straps for patients to clench during amputations performed without morphine. When gauze ran out, they used paper torn from books. When paper ran out, they left wounds exposed to the cold, reasoning that freezing temperatures reduced infection risk, a logic that sometimes worked and sometimes didn't. Medical personnel carried their own trauma, the memory of making triage decisions not based on who could be saved, but who would die slowest and thus free up resources for others. Prayer cards turned up in unusual numbers during the surrender. Soldiers who'd been perfunctory Catholics or Protestants, who'd not thought seriously about faith since childhood, tucked religious images into paybooks or sewed them into uniform linings. Some historians interpret this as foxhole religion, desperation driving men toward comfort they'd previously dismissed. Others note that carrying a prayer card was also a way of asserting identity beyond the Wehrmacht, beyond the regime, reaching back towards something personal and unjudgeable by earthly authority. The youngest soldiers, 18-year-olds conscripted in 1942, deployed to Stalingrad with minimal training, aged decades in months. Photographs of prisoners show faces that could be 30 or 50, impossible to date accurately, because starvation and trauma erased youth. Some of those boys survived captivity and returned to Germany in the 1950s as middle-aged men who'd spent more of their lives in Soviet camps than in their home country. They came back to a nation rebuilt, divided, moving forward into a future that had no place for Stalingrad stories except as cautionary history. The arithmetic remained brutal to the end. The Luftwaffe had promised 500 tons per day and delivered 115, an arithmetic death sentence that played out across 10 weeks in hunger, frostbite, and surrender. Of 91,000 captured, fewer than 6,000 returned, a survival rate under 7% that made captivity statistically more lethal than the fighting itself. And yet some did return. They married, had children, worked ordinary jobs, carried Stalingrad privately in the space between what they'd lived through and what they could bear to say aloud. Their children and grandchildren would grow up with silences at the dinner table, with questions deflected or answered in fragments, with the knowledge that something enormous and terrible had happened but remained just beyond reach. Stalingrad's legacy extended beyond casualty lists. It established a template for urban warfare, the tactical lessons about integrating arms, the strategic understanding that cities become traps for attackers, the recognition that logistics and morale matter more than courage. Military academies still study it, not for inspiration, but as a comprehensive catalogue of what not to do. Don't overextend supply lines, don't ignore weather, don't hold for political reasons what can't be held militarily, don't promise what you can't deliver, don't sacrifice armies for propaganda. The city itself became a symbol. Volgograd now, renamed in 1961 as part of de-Stalinization, but the battle remained Stalingrad in historical memory. Monuments commemorate it, the Motherland Calls statue visible for kilometers, museums displaying artifacts from the fighting, preserved ruins of the grain elevator and Pavlov's house marking, where ordinary men held against armies. For Germany, Stalingrad marked the beginning of the end, not immediately, not obviously to those living through it, but visible in retrospect as the point where victory became impossible and the only question was how long the dying would take. The war would continue 2 more years in the east, 2.5 in the west. Millions more would die. But the outcome was decided in those frozen ruins on the Volga, in the arithmetic of an airlift that couldn't deliver, in the decision to hold for prestige what should have been abandoned for survival. Stand in those ruins in February 1943, snow settling over the wreckage, silence broken only by wind and distant sounds of Soviet engineers clearing mines, and understand that you're witnessing the moment when myth met reality and shattered. The men who fought there, who starved there, who died or survived and wished they hadn't. They became ghosts before their hearts stopped, haunting a campaign that should never have been fought, trapped by orders that should never have been given, betrayed by promises that simple arithmetic proved were lies. And somewhere in a Soviet camp, years later, one of the survivors would wake from a nightmare about snow and hunger and know that he'd escaped Stalingrad's ruins but would never escape Stalingrad itself, that it was, written into his bones, his dreams, his silences, permanent as frostbite scars on fingers that would ache every winter for the rest of his life.